spring of 1991, every farmer in Huron County, Ontario told Meredith Callahan she was throwing good money after bad. They said it at the co-op in Goderich. They said it at the grain elevator in Clinton. They said it in the parking lot of St. Min, Andrews Presbyterian after the Sunday service, in that particular way that small farming communities have of saying things, quietly, to each other, just loud enough for the person in question to hear. Meredith Callahan had driven to a forestry nursery outside of Kincardine and bought 600 bur oak seedlings from a retired forester named Douglas Holt for $240. She was going to plant them across her cash crop fields, not along the windrow, not in the fence lines where the old elms had died, in the fields themselves, in the middle of a working grain farm in gray Huron clay loam soil that her late husband's family had been growing wheat and corn on since 1924. The farmers of Huron County had a diagnosis. She was not thinking clearly. Thomas Callahan had died of a stroke in November of 1989. He was 51 years old. He had left the farm to his wife, who had never grown up farming, who had come from a schoolteacher's family in Stratford, and who had, in the 2 years since his death, made several decisions that the neighbors found difficult to explain. The oak trees were the most difficult. They stopped diagnosing her in the summer of 1998, when the driest July in 44 years baked through southern Ontario and the Bruce Peninsula, when farmers in 3 surrounding counties watched their corn curl and their wheat go thin, and when someone driving the 4th concession noticed something on the Callahan property that didn't make sense. Her fields were not the same as everyone else's fields. Let me take you back 7 years. Let me show you what she planted. Let me show you who laughed and what they saw when they finally stopped. At the nursery outside of Kincardine in April of 1991, Douglas Holt had his oak seedlings in root trainer tubes on a long metal bench at the back of the greenhouse. He had been propagating bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, from local seed sources for 11 years. He had spent those years trying to convince Gray and Huron County farmers that trees belonged in their crop fields, not only along the edges. He had sold trees to municipalities, to conservation authorities, to hobby farmers with 20 acres who wanted something to look at from their kitchen windows. He had never sold a significant quantity to a working grain farmer for deliberate midfield planting. Meredith Callahan found him through the Gray Sauble Conservation Authority, which had given her a list of native tree nurseries when she called asking about something called alley cropping. She had asked them for the name of the person who had been doing it longest. Douglas was 61 years old when Meredith arrived. He had a master's degree in forest ecology from the University of Guelph and had spent 8 years as a provincial forester in the Muskoka district before coming back to his home county to grow trees commercially. He had stopped believing, around 1986, that anyone was going to listen to him before a disaster made them. Meredith asked him 4 questions. He answered them at length. She bought 600 seedlings, paid by check, and loaded the trays into the back of a 1987 Dodge half-ton with the care of someone who understood she was carrying something fragile and important. Douglas stood at the nursery door and watched her go. He had shown her his data. He had shown her the trial plots he had been running since 1983 on his own 15 acres, bur oak rows spaced 80 feet apart, winter wheat and oats grown in the alleys between, soil organic matter measurements taken twice yearly. He had shown her the numbers, a 12% average improvement in soil moisture retention in the alley rows closest to the trees, a measurable reduction in wind erosion, a modest but consistent yield premium in moderate drought years. He had also told her the truth, which was that it would take 8 to 10 years before the trees were large enough to make a difference, that the first 3 years were the hardest, that her neighbors were going to have opinions. She had nodded at all of it. Her brother-in-law Neil was at the farm when she pulled in with the seedlings. He was Thomas's younger brother, 53 years old, who ran 600 acres of cash crop east of Dungannon and had been coming by the Callahan farm on Tuesday mornings since Thomas died, whether Meredith had asked him to or not. He was standing by the equipment shed when she backed the truck in. He looked at the trays. He looked at Meredith. He looked at the trays again. Meredith, he said, "What in the world?" "Trees, Neil. I can see they're trees. You're going to plant them in the fields." "In the fields, yes." Neil took his cap off. He had been farming Huron County clay loam for 31 years. He understood the soil the way you understand something you have been failing at and recovering from your entire adult life. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who knew what he knew and was careful about everything else. Those are hardwood trees, Meredith. You know what a hardwood tree does to a cash crop field. I know exactly what it does. Thomas never would have. Thomas isn't here to decide, Meredith said. I am. Neil stood with his cap in his hand. He looked at the equipment shed, which still had Thomas's name on the side door in black paint, the letters slightly faded now after 2 winters. You're going to shade out your yield. I'm going to improve it, Neil. He put his cap back on. He left without saying anything else. He didn't come back for 4 months. The story moved through the county the way those stories always move. By the end of the week, it had reached the co-op in Guelph, where a retired farmer named Lorne Shearer delivered what became the standard verdict. The woman doesn't understand what she's doing. She came from Stratford. She's a schoolteacher's daughter. Thomas always ran a solid operation, and now she's planting a forest in the corn ground. At the equipment dealer in Clinton, a younger farmer named Bruce Pender heard it and shook his head. He said Thomas had been one of the straightest operators in the county. He said it was a shame. That's what it was. At the coffee counter at the Vanastra diner, which opened at 6 in the morning and where 4 of the older men in the district gathered most days to drink coffee that had been sitting since 5:30 and discuss conditions that were never quite right, a man named Gord Eisner said it plainly. Give it 2 years. She'll sell. The trees will come out. Someone sensible will buy the ground. The others agreed. They had seen this kind of thing before. Widows making decisions that needed to be undone. It was sad, but it was the natural course of things. What Huron County didn't know, what Meredith had not told Neil, or the co-op crowd, or the neighbors who had been leaving food on her porch since the funeral, was that she had been preparing this for 14 months. In January of 1990, 2 months after Thomas's funeral, she had driven alone to the Ontario Agricultural College in Guelph. She had made an appointment with a researcher named Dr. Patricia Ewan, an agronomist who had spent a decade studying temperate agroforestry systems and whose name appeared in 3 different papers that Meredith had found through the Stratford Public Library's Interlibrary Loan Service. She had spent a full day in Dr. Ewan's office. She had brought Thomas's soil records going back to 1972. She had brought the farm's yield history, the drainage tile maps, the OMAFRA soil survey, rainfall records from the weather station at Exeter that Thomas had kept in a green binder in the office. Dr. Ewan had looked at all of it for a long time. Then she had said 3 things. First, the Callahan farm's soil profile. Gray Huron clay loam over a fractured limestone subsoil was among the better candidates for alley cropping in southern Ontario, because the tree roots would follow the fracture lines into the subsoil moisture that the crop roots couldn't reach. Second, the farm's location on the lee side of the Bruce Peninsula meant it was exposed to crop-damaging northwest winds in a way that most Huron County farms weren't, and that the tree rows, once established, would reduce evapotranspiration losses in dry years significantly. Third, the species she needed was bur oak, not soft maple or ash, because bur oak was fire-resistant, drought-tolerant, extremely long-lived, and produced a root system that built soil organic matter over decades rather than depleting it. She had given Meredith Douglas Holt's name. Before Meredith left the office, Dr. Ewan had said one more thing. The trees will not save your yield in a normal year, she said. In a normal year, you may see a small reduction in the alley rows closest to the trees and a small improvement in everything else. The year that will matter is the year that is not normal. That is when you will understand what you built. Meredith had written it down in a notebook she had bought at a shopper's drug mart in Guelph on the way home. She had written it down in the same handwriting her mother had taught her at the kitchen table in Stratford when she was 7 years old. She spent the rest of 1990 designing the planting pattern. She was not going to plant in rows that ran the length of the field. She was going to plant in east-west oriented rows that crossed the prevailing wind direction, spaced 100 feet apart, which Dr. Ewan had shown her would provide meaningful wind protection across approximately 85% of the alley area once the trees reached 30 feet. The rows would interrupt her ability to run long passes with the combine, but she had already worked out the headland adjustments on graph paper in the farm office using Thomas's field maps. The office was where Meredith had spent most of the winter of 1990. Thomas had run the farm's records out of a small room off the back of the house, steel filing cabinet, a desk he had built from 2 sawhorses and a piece of 3/4 plywood in 1976, a phone mounted on the wall with a 50-foot cord so he could pace while he talked, a window that looked out on the north field. Meredith had not changed anything in the room since November of 1989. She had paid the bills from it, taken the insurance calls from it, handled the crop sales settlements from it. She had not moved the sawhorses or changed the cord on the phone. It was in that room, at that plywood desk, looking out at the north field in the gray January light, that she had made the decision, not on impulse, not out of grief, though grief was present in every room of that house that winter, out of something that had been building since before Thomas died, since before she had any reason to think the farm would be hers to manage. Meredith had not grown up on a farm, but her maternal grandfather, Albert Rousseau, had come from a farming family in the Beauce region of Quebec and had farmed in Lanark County, Ontario, for 40 years before retiring to Stratford. He had kept woodlots on every farm he ever owned, not for timber value, not as a windbreak afterthought, but as deliberate parts of the operation, managed as carefully as the crop fields. He had tried to explain to Meredith, when she was 11 and spending the summer with him in Lanark County, what the trees did for the soil. Trees are slow capital, he had told her. You put them in for your children, not for yourself, but they pay interest every year from the day you plant them, if you plant them right. She had not understood what he meant until she read Dr. Ewan's papers in the Stratford Library in the winter of 1990. She planted the first row on April 28, 1991. The ground was cold. It had rained 3 days earlier, and the clay loam had a skin of frost on it at 7 in the morning. She had a tractor-mounted tree planter she had borrowed from Douglas Holt, a 2-row unit that required 1 person to drive and 1 person to ride the planting seat and feed seedlings into the furrow openers. She drove. Her neighbor's daughter, a 16-year-old named Sandra who had worked for Thomas during haying season, fed seedlings on the planting seat for $35 a day and did not once ask Meredith why she was putting trees in her crop field. Sandra just planted. Meredith just drove. They finished the first row in 2.5 hours. By the end of the first week, they had 4 rows in the ground, 240 seedlings. By the end of the second week, all 600 were planted, running east to west across the 4 main fields and lines that Meredith had staked out the previous fall with survey flags. She recorded every row in a new notebook. Row number, field, date of planting, spacing, seedling condition at planting. She cross-referenced each row to the soil drainage tile lines shown on Thomas's tile maps, because she needed to know if any of her tree roots were going to intersect with the tiles in a way that would cause problems in 20 years. She had already talked to the tile drainage contractor in Wingham about it. He had told her bur oak roots did not aggressively seek drain tiles the way willows and poplars did. She had made a note of that too. Total cost of the establishment a year, $388. That was the seedlings, the rental on the planting attachment, and Sandra's wages for 2 weeks. She had spent 2 weeks of fieldwork time and $388 on something that Neil had told her was going to ruin her yield, that Lorne Shearer had told the co-op crowd was evidence of poor judgment, and that Gord Eisner was still predicting would be undone by a sensible buyer within 2 years. She did not tell any of them about Dr. Ewan. She did not tell them about her grandfather's notebooks, which were in a box in the farm office, in handwriting that was difficult to read, because Albert Rousseau had written in a mix of French and English that reflected the way he had actually thought. She did not tell them about the 14 months of preparation, the library loans, the solo drive to Guelph in January. They were watching a recently widowed woman from Stratford plant trees in a cornfield. They were not watching a woman execute a plan she had been building for longer than most of them had been paying attention. By the end of June in 1991, 47 of the seedlings had died, an 8% loss, which was within the range Douglas had predicted, and which she replaced in the fall with seedlings she bought from a second nursery near Owen Sound. In the summer of 1992, a dry July took out 11 more. Meredith drove water to the affected rows with a tank mounted on the Dodge until the rain came in August. Neil drove past on the concession road one evening while she was running the hose. He slowed down but didn't stop. The county settled into its verdict. In 2 years, maybe 3, it would become obvious that the trees were hurting yield, and Meredith would either pull them or sell the farm to someone who would. That was the reasonable expectation. What the county was watching, without understanding what it was watching, was a farm being restructured from the root system up. By 1994, the surviving seedlings were averaging 6 feet tall. By 1995, 9 feet, with canopy spreads beginning to cast morning and late afternoon shade across the nearest alley sections. By 1996, the tallest trees were 14 feet, and Meredith had begun to see something in her yield maps that she had expected but not let herself quite believe until she saw it. The alley sections between the tree rows were yielding differently than the open field sections away from the trees. The difference was not dramatic, not yet, but it was consistent. The soil in the alley sections closest to the tree rows was darker. The organic matter was building. She had been sending soil samples to the lab at the University of Guelph since 1992, 4 times a year, 8 locations per field, coded to a map she kept in the farm office. By 1996, the trend was clear in the numbers even if it wasn't visible to the eye of anyone driving past on the concession road. She showed the data to Douglas Holt in the fall of 1996. He sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours going through it. "You're 5 years ahead of where I expected," he said. "The moisture retention numbers." "Yes, and the organic matter." Douglas looked up at her. "Your grandfather's notebooks. Can I read them?" She gave him the box. He returned it 3 weeks later with a note inside that said only, "He was right about everything. I wish I had known him." The rain went thin in the spring of 1997. By fall of that year, the stock ponds on farms west of the Maitland River were lower than the old-timers had seen them in 2 decades. The consensus at the diner in Vanastra was cautious. Last time it got like this was 76, and that turned around by August. This will turn around too. It did not turn around. The spring of 1998 came in dry and stayed dry. The May rains that Gray and Huron County depended on to charge the subsoil before summer came in at 40% of normal. The planted corn went in on time, but it went into dry ground, and the growers who had been farming long enough to read subsoil moisture by the feel of the furrow knew by the second week of June that this was going to be a hard year. By the middle of July, it was the hardest year many of them had seen. The corn that should have been knee-high was mid-shin and starting to roll. The winter wheat that had looked promising in May was short-strawed and filling thin. The Maitland River at the gauge in Wingham was the lowest recorded since 1954, while levels across the county were dropping. Bruce Pinder sold his soybean crop standing in late July to a feed buyer from London for less than half of what it would have cost him to harvest. He had made the same calculation as every other grower in the county. The cost of harvesting was going to exceed the value of the crop. Better to cut the loss now. Lorne Shearer, who was 70 now and had rented out most of his ground but kept 40 acres and corn out of habit, let the crop go brown in the field in August. He didn't bother to spray or side dress. There was no point. Gord Eisner's corn on his home farm came in at 62 bushels per acre in October, against a county average that he had been accustomed to of 140 to 160. He had been farming for 44 years. He had never seen a July like that one. On the 3rd of August, Gord was driving east on the 4th concession, on his way back from the elevator in Blythe, where he had been asking about fall custom combining rates and not receiving good news. He had driven that road most of his adult life. He drove past the Callahan North Field the way he had driven past it thousands of times. He stopped. The corn in Meredith's North Field was not what the corn in every other field in Huron County was. It was not lush. It was not a record crop, but it was standing. The ears were filled, the stalks were green, not the papery brown that had taken over every other field along the 4th concession. And between the east-west tree rows, the rows that Gord had been predicting would be pulled out by a sensible buyer since 1991, the corn in those alley sections was the best corn in the field. The soil there was darker. The plants there were taller by 4 or 5 inches. The leaf edges were not rolling. The bur oaks themselves were 22 feet tall by then. Their canopy spread was 15 to 18 feet on each side of the row. The shade they cast in the early morning and late afternoon fell across the nearest 30 feet of the alley on each side, which was where the soil moisture difference was most visible. Gord Eisner got out of his truck. He walked to the fence line. He stood there for a while looking at the field. He looked at the trees. He looked at the corn between the trees. He looked at his own hands, which had been in Huron County soil for 44 years, and which understood, in the way that a farmer's hands eventually understand everything, what the difference between that field and every other field he had passed that morning actually meant. He drove home. He stood at his own field fence. He looked at his own corn, which was the papery brown it should not have been in August, and which had been that way since the 3rd week of July. He drove back to the Callahan farm. He parked on the concession road. He got out and stood at her front gate for a long time. He did not honk. He did not walk up to the door. He just stood there, looking at the north field across the road, watching the corn stand green in the dry August morning, while his own corn was failing 3 miles away. Meredith saw him from the upstairs window. She did not go out. She watched him stand there for close to 20 minutes. Then he got back in his truck and drove away. By the 3rd week of August, there were other trucks on the 4th concession. Farmers she recognized and some she didn't. They parked on the shoulder, sometimes 2 or 3 trucks at a time, and they stood at the fence looking at the field. Some of them got out and crouched down and looked at the soil in the ditch at the road edge, the way farmers look at soil. None of them came to the door. The first person who came to the door was not a neighbor. It was a woman named Janet Ford, who was the district crop specialist for the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and who had been hearing about Meredith Callahan's fields for 2 years before she finally drove out to see them herself. She had come in May, before the drought had declared itself, and had spent a full day walking the alley rows and taking notes. She had come back in August with 2 researchers from Guelph. Janet came to the door on August 18, 1998. "Meredith," she said when Meredith opened it, "I don't know if you've been into town much lately." "I've been here. People have been stopping on the concession road." "I know. Have any of them come to the door?" "No." She made Janet tea. They sat at the kitchen table, which was the same table where Thomas had eaten every meal of his life and where Meredith had eaten every meal of her life on this farm for 24 years. Janet was 44. She had grown up in Listowel and had spent her career trying to move Ontario grain farmers toward practices that the majority of them regarded as experiments at best and affronts at worst. She looked at Meredith across the table and said, "I think this summer is going to be the thing that starts the conversation, not because the numbers will convince them. Numbers never convinced a gray Huron farmer of anything they weren't already inclined to believe, but because they can see it from the road. You can't argue with corn that's still standing in August when your corn has been brown since July." Meredith said, "When the rain comes back, they'll go back to what they know." "Some will," Janet said, "not all." She paused. She looked at her notebook, then back at Meredith. "What you have done here, the way you've designed this, the data you've kept, it is the most complete on-farm agroforestry record in Ontario. I am not exaggerating. The Guelph researchers who came out in May said the same thing. Would you consider being part of a formal study?" Meredith said she would consider it. She did consider it for 3 days. Then she called Janet back and said yes. The study ran from 1999 through 2004. The Guelph team, led by a soil scientist named Dr. Marcus Webb, published the primary paper in the Canadian Journal of Soil Science in 2002. It documented the soil organic matter increases, the moisture retention differentials, the yield premiums in moderate and severe drought years, the wind erosion reductions. It included 7 years of Meredith's field records and soil samples and yield maps. Meredith was listed in the acknowledgments as a cooperating producer. She had asked not to be listed as a co-author, though Dr. Webb had pushed for it. She said her grandfather's name should be in the acknowledgments too, and it was. Albert Rousseau, Lanark County, Ontario, 1931-1998, who understood slow capital. Albert had died in January of 1998, at 97 years old, in a nursing home in Stratford, still speaking in a mixture of French and English that the nurses had learned to follow. He had not seen the drought that summer. He had not seen what his granddaughter built with the thing he had tried to teach her when she was 11. Meredith thought about that often, in the years after. She thought about it the way you think about the things you wish a person had lived to see. Neil came back in October of 1998. He had not been to the farm since a hard conversation in the spring of 1993. 5 years of silence between them, and he had driven past the field on the concession road 3 times in August before he finally turned into the lane. Meredith was in the farm office when she heard the truck. She went out. He was standing in the lane with his cap in his hand. He was looking past her at the north field, where the corn had been harvested the week before at 138 bushels per acre, against a county average that year of 71. "Neil," she said. "Meredith." He cleared his throat. He looked at the field for a long moment. "I read the piece in the Exeter Times-Advocate," he said. "I figured you might." He was quiet. He turned his cap over in his hands the way men do when they have something they've been carrying for a while. "Thomas would have planted these trees," he said finally. Meredith didn't answer right away. "He would have," Neil said. "He was stubborn, and he didn't like to be told things, but he would have come around. I know because I know how he thought about the land. He didn't farm for himself. He farmed for whoever was going to come after." "I know," Meredith said. "I told him once, years ago, that he should try shelter belts. Not in the fields, just the edges. He said he'd think about it. He was still thinking about it when he died." "I know he was." Neil put his cap back on. He looked at the trees along the north field, the ones that were now 23 feet tall and would be 30 feet by the middle of the next decade and 45 feet by the time anyone alive in that county today was old. "I'm sorry I wasn't here," he said. "You're here now." He looked at her. "Can I walk the fields with you?" "You don't have to ask." They walked for 2 hours. She showed him the alley spacing, the soil sample locations, the drainage tile intersections she had been monitoring since 1992. She showed him the oldest rows, where the tree canopies had begun to close in the center and where the leaf litter was building into a layer of black organic matter unlike anything else in the county's clay loam ground. She showed him the North Field yield map, the one that showed, in gradients of blue and green, the moisture distribution in the soil profile in July 1998, the map that told the story of that summer more clearly than any sentence could. Neil looked at the map for a long time. "How many trees can I get from Douglas?" he said. "As many as you want. I'll call him tomorrow." She put her hand briefly on his arm. "Welcome back. I should have come sooner." Meredith ran the farm for another 18 years after the summer of 1998. She did not expand the operation. Thomas had always said that a well-run small farm beat a poorly run large one, and Meredith had never disagreed. She extended the alley cropping system to cover all 290 acres of workable ground by 2003. She continued sending soil samples to Guelph 4 times a year. She continued keeping the yield maps in Thomas's filing cabinet. In the drought of 2012, the worst on record for the region since the 1930s, her corn came in at 121 bushels per acre. The county average was 68. The paper that Dr. Webb published in 2002 was cited in 47 subsequent studies in North American and European agroforestry literature. Meredith received a letter about it from a researcher in France who was studying climate-adaptive cropping systems. She wrote back a short reply and enclosed a copy of one of Albert Rousseau's notebooks, the one from the Lanark County farm in 1961, where he had written in his mixed French-English, in columns that didn't quite line up, his yield records and his soil notes, and his observations about the way the woodlot edges behaved in dry summers compared to the open fields. The researcher wrote back to say she had the notebook translated and was citing it in her next paper, with Albert Rousseau's name as the original source. Meredith read that letter at the kitchen table where Thomas had eaten every meal of his life. She folded it carefully and put it in the box with the rest of Albert's notebooks. In 2008, the Ontario Soil and Crop Improvement Association gave Meredith their annual Stewardship Award at a dinner in Stratford. She attended. She wore a blue dress she had bought in Godric the previous summer. She accepted the award and stood at the podium for less than a minute. She said, "My grandfather told me when I was 11 years old that trees are slow capital. You plant them for your children, not for yourself, but they pay interest every year from the day you go in." He was a farmer in Lanark County for 40 years, and he understood something about this land that I have spent the last 17 years trying to prove on 290 acres of Huron County clay. He was right. I just had better equipment. The room laughed. Then they stood up, and it took a long time for the room to settle again. "Sandra," The 16-year-old who had fed seedlings into the furrow openers on that cold April morning in 1991 was in the room that night. She was 33 now, and she was farming 200 acres near Walton with her husband. And there were 800 burrope seedlings in east-west rows across her soybean fields that she had planted 3 years earlier with the help of a forestry extension guide that listed Meredith Callahan's operation as a primary case study. Sandra had not told Meredith she was coming to the dinner. She stood in the back of the room during the applause and said nothing, which was the same thing she had done 22 years earlier on the back of a tractor planter in a Huron County field at 7 in the morning. Feeding trees into cold clay ground while the woman in front of her drove forward in straight lines and did not explain herself to anyone. That is what patient knowledge looks like. Not the announcement, not the vindication. The straight lines, driven forward, one pass at a time, while everyone on the road thinks they know what they're looking at and does not know at all. In 2016, Meredith handed the farm to her niece Claire, who had been working summers on the place since she was 19 and who had a degree in environmental studies from the University of Waterloo that she had followed up by working for 3 years with the Regenerative Agriculture Organization in Manitoba. Meredith moved into the smaller house on the south end of the property that Thomas's father had built in 1949. She kept the farm office as it was. She kept the soil sample records, all of them in the filing cabinet. She kept Albert's notebooks in the box on the desk. The oldest bur oak trees on the farm are 40 years old now. They are 51 feet tall. The canopy spread covers the alley rows the way Meredith calculated on graph paper in the farm office in the winter of 1990, working with a ruler and Thomas's field maps at a plywood desk on 2 sawhorses, while the Huron County farming community was busy making predictions about what she would and would not do with land they had decided was too good for trees. The trees are still there. They were there before anyone believed they would be. They will be there long after everyone who laughed in 1991 is gone. That is what slow capital means. That is what Albert Rousseau knew in Lanark County in 1961, and what his granddaughter planted into the cold clay of Huron County 30 years later, in the middle of a field, in the middle of a county that was not ready to listen, and which listened, in the end, not because anyone explained it to them, but because it was standing right there, green in the driest July in 44 years, visible from the road. I keep thinking about the moment Gord Eisner stood at Meredith's front gate and didn't knock. He drove past her field, saw what he saw, drove home, looked at his own failing corn, and drove back. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he left without saying a word. That detail stays with me more than any of the yield numbers, because I think most of us have been on both sides of that gate at some point. We've been the ones standing outside, looking at something that proved us wrong, and we've had to decide whether to walk up and say it out loud. And we've been Meredith, watching through the upstairs window, not going up to make it easier for him, just letting the field speak. What Meredith built wasn't just an alley cropping system. It was the result of a specific kind of character that I think is rare and worth paying attention to. She was honest enough to go find someone who actually knew more than she did. She drove alone to Guelph in January, 2 months after a funeral, and sat in a researcher's office for a full day showing a stranger her husband's soil records. That takes a kind of integrity that has nothing to do with pride. It's the willingness to say, I don't know enough yet. Let me go find out. A lot of people never get there, because being wrong in front of someone else costs them too much. Then there's the thinking itself. She didn't just act on a feeling or a memory of her grandfather's voice. She read the research. She mapped the fields on graph paper. She understood the drainage tiles well enough to call the contractor in Wingham and ask the right question about root intrusion 20 years out. That kind of careful, patient reasoning is what separates a hunch from a plan. Albert Rousseau had the instinct. Meredith turned it into something that could be measured, documented, and eventually cited in 47 scientific papers. The wisdom passed down was real, but she did the work to make it provable. And then she waited 7 years, through the neighbors' predictions about sensible buyers and sensible decisions, through Neil going silent for 4 months and then 5 years, through the dry summers that took out seedlings and cracked her hands and wore out the alternator on the Dodge. She kept the notebooks. She kept sending the soil samples. She kept driving the rows in straight lines without explaining herself to anyone. That, to me, is the hardest part of the whole story. Not the planting, the waiting, the willingness to hold to a course of action for years when no one around you can see what you see yet, and when the only thing you have to show for it is data in a filing cabinet and trees that are not yet tall enough to matter. Most people quit somewhere in that gap. They quit because the gap is long and the silence from the community is heavy and the cost of continuing is real. Meredith didn't quit, not because she was certain, because she had done the work to earn the right to be certain. I think about Albert Rousseau writing in his mixed French and English in Lanark County in 1961. He knew what trees did for land. He tried to pass it on. His granddaughter received it, carried it for 30 years, and then planted it into cold clay in Huron County on a morning in April when the ground still had frost on it. That is what good character actually produces over time. Not a single dramatic moment. A line of trees, 51 feet tall, still standing,